Thanks everyone for joining our webinar, Going Purple, Measurably Improving Your Security Posture with Purple Team Engagements, presented by our team lead of defense and countermeasures, Ben Mauk. My name is Chris Besch, and I'm the Vice President of Sales and Marketing at TrustedSec. Here's the agenda for today's presentation. We'll provide a brief background about TrustedSec, talk about red, blue, and purple teams, and how to conduct a purple team exercise. We will leave time for question and answers after the presentation. Please type any questions you have during or after the presentation in the questions section of the webinar toolbar. We'll try to get to all of them today, and if we can't, we will send a follow-up to everyone who attended. You can also feel free to reach out to us directly at webinar@trustedsec.com. TrustedSec is an information security consulting firm founded by David Kennedy in 2012. Our goal is to help organizations defend against threats of all kinds and change the security industry for the better. We are a full-service consulting firm. As you can see, we help our clients in 5 key areas. One of them being security testing and analysis, and with some of the services corresponding to that, as you can see, penetration testing and web testing. Another one, program assessment and compliance. The third being security program management. The fourth, remediation assistance and training. And the fifth area, incident response and forensics. TrustedSec can be a one-stop shop for a company's information security needs. As you can see, we help build security programs, we test them, and we fix them. We also help companies prepare for breaches and the forensics if a breach does occur. A little bit about our consultants. At TrustedSec, we hire senior level resources to lead our engagements. Many are industry leaders who speak and teach at conferences or on the news, write open source tools to help improve the community, and so on. We also have an attack research team led by Carlos Perez, which is made up of ex-NSA and FBI type individuals that supports our consultants by creating new attack vectors, proprietary tools, and much more. And now for the speaker. Ben Mauk is the team lead of defense and countermeasures at TrustedSec with over 20 years of industry experience. A little over half of that time was spent doing defense before moving to the offensive side. As you can see, he utilizes his defense to refine his offensive skills and in turn uses that knowledge to provide customers with a better understanding of defensive methodologies. With that, let me turn it over to Ben.
Hey, thanks so much, Chris, and thanks everyone for joining our webinar today. Those who don't know, my alias on the internet is Ben10. Most people can't pronounce Mauk, so that's why I changed it to 10. So if you know of Ben10, that is also me. I've been on a couple of calls in the past where it said Ben Mauk, and then I got on the call and they're like, hey, have you heard of this Ben10 guy? And I'm like, yeah, that's me. So for those who don't know, that is who I am. I did spend a lot of my time in the defensive world, doing a lot of stuff on the defensive side. Moved over to offense. I've been learning, throughout the time on the different offensive pieces as well. And the great thing about that is having both that defensive and offensive knowledge has really allowed us to grow our purple team offering that we have here at TrustedSec, and we wanted to share a little bit about that with you. I think the screen might have glitched a little. Let's see if this works. There we go. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of the different teams that we have here. When I get on site with clients, there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between the role of a red team, the role of a blue team, and how the purple team actually goes in. So I wanted to start with the red team, get a clear understanding of what the actual red team is, talk a little bit about the blue team, and then I'll show you the purple team and how they're actually 3 unique things. They're not just a red team plus a blue team. So the red team, so to make clear, the red team is going to be a realistic attack scenario. So you're actually going to have an attacker that's going to, or a consultant that is going to mimic what an attacker's mindset is going to be. Now, the red team is, typically either done by a third-party consulting company. A lot of times corporations will even have an own internal red team. This is something that's done on an annual or even oftentimes a biannual basis, where you set up an engagement to have a team of consultants compromise your organization as in the same way an attacker would. This is oftentimes can span several weeks to even a couple of months, where the team's primary goal is to get in. Oftentimes, what ends up happening is with the red team is that they typically only get a single attack path into your organization. And this is vital. A red team exercise is definitely one of those things that you want to run and you want to have that insight into. But one of the differences here is that the red team, you know, they're definitely trying to avoid detection. So they're going to come up with spear phishing campaigns. They're going to do, you know, 90% of their work is going to be on research, learning about your organization, figuring out the best possible attack path that they can go in. And as I said, at the end of the engagement, they may have only found a single attack path in. While that single attack path should be identified and addressed within your defensive controls, the fact of the matter is you really only learned of a single attack path. There may be others, but in the given time period that the red team has, you know, they may only be able to necessarily report on the one. Now, obviously, you know, there's a reason for this. Now, in a typical pen test, you can either assess an entire organization or select a business unit. And typically in the pen test, you're looking at vulnerabilities, you know, a lot of stuff all within a short amount of time. Whereas in a red team, they can assess if a determined attacker was targeting your organization, if there's any potential way of compromising it. So there's a big difference between a red team and a typical penetration test. Your typical penetration test is going to try and cover everything from vulnerability analysis to weak credentials to, you know, do you have a system that has, you know, default credentials somewhere? The red team, they may only find a single attack path in. Very valid, definitely worth having as part of your organization, and something that you definitely want to have as part of your, you know, annual testing that you go along with it. The difference between the red team that I just described and a blue team is the blue team is going to be specifically looking at the defense of the organization. Oftentimes, blue teams are comprised mostly of you know, vulnerability management, patch management, you know, looking at hardening systems. They will typically involve your infrastructure team as well as any type of teams that include threat hunting, forensics, network access controls, your firewall controls. And what often ends up happening is on the blue team side is it becomes more of a focus on patch management, remediation, and you know, plugging any of the recent holes that might be shown out there. Again, very vital and necessary to an organization. The difference here is that the blue team's part on the, you know, focus on this part is more of remediation, stopping, you know, plugging the holes, and not so much on learning the attacker mentality. The blue team on this side more of is on what we would call a deflective or a deterrence. And so what ends up happening on the blue team is they have a potential to become very narrow focused. What ends up happening is that when a 0-day drops or a new patch is released by Microsoft, or a new, you know, hot vulnerability comes up that's got this neat fancy logo and URL, is that becomes the blue team's focus. And it should be. You definitely want to patch those and identify it. But what ends up happening is that we get this security exhaustion within our blue teams. Most blue teams are under-resourced. Most of them don't have an exceptional amount of budget that goes from, you know, to being able to build all of this stuff out. And I've even seen corporations where their infrastructure team is also doing the security. And so what ends up happening is that it kind of ends up in a situation where our blue teams are constantly chasing after all of the newest, you know, vectors that are popping up. And what ends up happening is we end up with this whack-a-mole defense, where something pops up and you go after it and you hit it. Something else comes up, you go after it, you hit it. And you never get this feeling of that you're actually gaining any type of ground on the red team. The two pieces of this, the red and the blue, are very vital to an organization. You want to have those red teams. You want to see what an attacker can do. You definitely need your blue team. You need it to be set up in such a way that it is patching those vulnerabilities. You don't need to have a system that's still vulnerable to MS08067 or MS17010, which were your Net API vulnerability from 2008 and Eternal Blue from 2017. We don't need those in our environment, and we definitely want to make sure that those are patched. The problem becomes is the attacker mentality these days are not so much focusing on those vulnerabilities as those initial vectors. As we see ransomware and all of the other things that are being dropped, they're moving further and further away from direct exploitation of these vulnerabilities and more looking at ways that we can compromise the system without necessarily leveraging a vulnerability. So with the blue teams also, you know, the typical focus is going to be around vulnerability management, patching, and the blue team will assess if there are other gaps to identify that allow an attack to go unauthorized access to a system or even a physical location. So this will typically also involve like looking at the physical security controls of the organization. So I went through and I wanted to just clearly define the difference between the red team and the blue team, and also identify the fact that the red team engagement versus a blue team engagement is still different than just your normal penetration test. We can't take a red team and throw some blue on it and call it a purple team. We'll see a lot of places that will try and do it in that manner, but just because you have a red team engagement and you have a blue team and you maybe talk a little bit about it, that doesn't necessarily turn it into a purple team. And this is where, we have tried to set ourselves apart from other organizations when we design a purple team, is we do it in a completely different way. And we want to go through a little bit about that and show you the differences and why we feel that this is not red plus blue or red versus blue, but is a completely separate offering. So let's talk a little bit about what those purple teams look like. The process of a purple team is to perform the attacks and analyze them in the real time, utilizing whatever defensive controls that you have. It's done at the same time with red and blue in the same room. Most importantly, this is not a pen test. Purple teaming should not follow the penetration tester execution standard, which is a standard that most organizations will follow when they perform a pen test or even often a red team. The purple team is made up of a huge group of people with very specialized skills made up of both red and blue teams with a focus on generating several attacks and evaluating several defensive controls all at the same time. You're going to have your red team that you call it, which is not necessarily going to be low and slow. Their purpose of the red is going to be to try as many attacks as they can, and the idea is to show those and say, we're running this attack, can you guys detect it? And if the blue is unable to detect it, then it's a share and often a training and a teaching environment to where you can go, so this is what a lateral spray is. So if I've captured, Chris's password, and I go and I try and log into 40,000 other computers, how can you see that within your environment? Now, what's interesting about that specific attack, and we call that one the lateral spray, is that's not a vulnerability. Chris's ability to log into multiple boxes is designed within the Windows environment. That's not a vulnerability. It's not something you patch. It's not something that you can necessarily turn off. Some of that you can disable with logging in over the network, but still having Chris to be able to log into a system is a necessary need of the organization and for the business to do its business. Chris was hired to do a job. He needs to be able to log in. So the key there is demonstrating the attacker mentality is, as I got Chris's credentials through a spear phishing attack, or whether I've captured his credentials off the wire, or whether or not I social engineered him in some way. But I have Chris's credentials. The other idea is Chris could be a malicious actor. He could be an insider threat for all you know. You could have hired it. He could have been a disgruntled employee. Well, now all of a sudden, Chris is not content with having just that one set of credentials. He might be looking at, is there another place where I have administrative privileges? Is there another place where I can go that I have access to that maybe has a password file or a web configuration file that has credentials stored in clear text? And so the idea is to begin to look at what that attacker mentality looks like once they land on the system. It's interesting to note that on a purple team, we don't really care about the initial vector. We don't care if the attacker got in through a spearfish. We don't care if the attacker got in because it's an insider threat. We don't care if the attacker got in because someone physically broke into your place of business and planted a box. The great thing about this is that once an attacker lands on your network, they have to still perform certain behaviors and activities that oftentimes trip up the detections if you know what to look for. And the great thing about these purple team events is that we actually get to teach you and say, I've got credentials, I'm on your network, I have to go somewhere. I have to do something. Oftentimes they're not just content with the one box. So that's the whole purpose of this. And it's a learning experience between both the red and the blue at the same time. When you're building a team to do this, you can't just make it 5 red people and then 1 blue guy. That's not going to be any benefit. Most organizations have had multiple pen tests, they've had multiple red teams, and it's very common to just see the red team just beat up on the blue. And it turns into this mentality of, hey, I broke all of your stuff, you're welcome. But that doesn't do a significant amount to change an organization's security posture. It'll definitely identify the fact that you have vulnerabilities that need to be addressed, and those are very important. But when we're looking at a purple team, the end goal is to actually change the organization's security posture. And so this becomes more of a training and a share and learn than it is of anything else. During this engagement, we're not necessarily going to be focusing on the fact that you've got 2,000 machines that are still vulnerable to MS-17010. That would be more of an initial vector type of thing and should be covered under your normal pen test and your normal vulnerability management program. So we're not going to necessarily focus our efforts during this engagement on identifying those. We're just going to assume breach. We're going to assume that the attacker has a foothold. And now we want to identify, is there a way we can see that attacker behavior regardless of that initial vector? When you bring your team together, it's most importantly that it is not red versus blue. You're on the same team. And one of the biggest problems that you see and you get a lot of resistance is when, especially if you have an internal red team, but also if it's a third party, is when the red team comes in or a penetration testing comes in and they have this huge list of all of the things that are broken. Not only is it more work for the blue because now your under-resourced and understaffed blue team is like, hey, I've got 100 more things I have to fix, and I have to track down the business owner, and the business owner has to evaluate whether or not this can be fixed. If it can't be fixed, then we've got to evaluate whether or not we can accept the risk, and it's a 6 to 8 month process to get something remediated. By that time, it may or may not have been remediated, and your pen test is up to come up again. So what ends up happening is that it's an us versus them. Red team comes in, breaks everything, walks out and says, here you go, you have a lot of work to do. That's not what we're doing here. Red's goal in this engagement is to teach and educate and to help blue identify the ways that an attacker can move around within your organization. It is meant to have the blue understand that when they see certain events come in to whatever SIM that they're utilizing or whatever tool they're using, that when you see these specific events with these specific identifiers, this correlates to this attack. So for example, let's go back to our lateral spray that we had talked about before. When you do a lateral spray, you have a set of valid credentials. And my goal is to find out, does Chris have admin privileges anywhere within the network? And so what I'll do is I will log into several thousand machines utilizing Chris's credentials. Now, they all are successful logins. I have no risk of really locking out his account unless he changes the password during the middle of the spray. But the chances of that are almost none. And so I log into all of these systems trying to find out where he might have admin access. Now, there's no guarantee that Chris does, but I still need to figure this out. From the Blues perspective, what they're seeing is they're seeing a lot of authentication success messages come in, which is event ID 4624. A lot of organizations don't look at 4624 because it's super loud and spammy. The unfortunate reality is if you're not looking at that event, you won't be able to see the specific attack. This works on a fully patched Windows 2016 server, Windows 10, it works 100% all the time. So if you're spraying this across the network and you're not getting those event success messages, then it becomes very difficult. So we teach them, let's turn these on and see what this looks like. So we turn on the 4624, we perform the lateral spray. Then we educate the blue team and we tell them, we're looking for a single source IP that is hitting more than 5% of your total number of assets, utilizing a single set of credentials within a 72-hour period. So let me say that again. So we're looking for a single attacking source IP with a single username that is authenticating successfully against about more than 5% of your total number of assets. That behavior is, we have seen it across, hundreds of organizations, and very rarely, if ever, do I ever see a situation where there is a single source IP utilizing a single account logging into more than 5% of the assets. That is not your vulnerability scanner. And what's neat is when we run this attack, and if you do have a vulnerability scanner, it shows up as a detection because your vulnerability scanner is doing exactly that. It's attempting a lateral spray. And that's something that you guys should be identifying. And so what happens is when you have the red team explain that to the blue team, they get a better understanding of what they're seeing and why these events are so important. And it's a share that goes back and forth. What's also neat is as the blue team has this ability to identify these attacks, it challenges the red team to come up with new and unique ways to do it. So what ends up happening is that your security posture actively begins to change because your blue team actively understands what's going on with the attack and they can write the detection for it. And if you do have an internal red, it challenges them to not use the same attacks that they have and allows them to grow and to come up with other ways that they might try to compromise your organization. The team should focus on non-standard and out-of-the-box attacks that go beyond simple vulnerability exploitation. This is key. When we run our purple team engagements, we have 45 attacks that do not use an exploit. We don't have any, they work fully patched systems, gold image, they even work with your, any type of EDR that you might have on there. Most of them work without tripping any of those up because we're using Windows the way Windows was designed to be used. It's just that we have an attacker's mentality that goes along with it. And so the idea is as systems begin to deploy more EDR solutions and they have more controls set up in place and they're actually doing proper patch management, the attacker isn't relying on that nearly as much. And they're more relying on how can I gain access to this organization without necessarily tripping anything up. The team should include SMEs from all parts of the blue teams, as well as highly skilled red teams. What's important about the blue teams for the SMEs, this includes your infrastructure, your network controls, your SIM SMEs. This should also include anyone from, maybe even from your risk or even your vulnerability management team. All parts of this are important to ensuring that the security posture change that you guys are going for at the end of this result is done. Because you have to have buy-in from all parts of the blue team. One of the best ways you can get that buy-in is from encouraging them and showing them that this is not going to be an us versus them. This is more of a training for you guys so you get a better understanding of what an attacker mentality looks like. So how teamers? Well, it just depends on the size of your organization. We typically will have about 2 to 4 red teamers if we bring our own. Sometimes we'll bring 2, and an organization will provide a couple. But you want there to be enough red to provide enough work for the blue, but not so that it turns into just another pen test. So you definitely want to make sure that it's not, 15 red or 5 red and only 1 blue teamer. You definitely need more blue people than red on the purple team. It doesn't have to be a significantly more, but if you have 2 red, I would recommend 4 blue. And the idea is it's fast and easy to run the red team attacks. It's not so fast and easy oftentimes to write the detection or to build the control. So we typically would like, maybe 1 to 2 red and maybe 3 to 4 blue. It just depends. You want at least 1 SME from each of your security controls on your team. So whoever that is, and they may just only be necessary for 1 or 2 of the detections that are written, and they don't necessarily have to be tied up for the whole week, but those SMEs should be available. I'll give you an example. Is we were doing a purple team and we were doing a rogue device detection. And the idea behind a rogue device detection is when I go into an organization, and especially if it's a physical attack, and if I drop my box onto your network, I'm going to make it look like one of your multifunction printers. Most organizations don't own their multifunction printers outright. They are provided by a third-party company that either supports Ricoh or Xerox or Canon, Brother, HP, whatever the case may be. And so it's oftentimes easy enough for us to figure out who your vendor is. And then when we go in, we make our MAC address match one of your multifunction printers. So if I know you have Ricoh at your organization, when I plug in my malicious device, it's going to show up as a Ricoh. We do that for 2 reasons. One, it's successful in bypassing most NAC controls because most NAC controls are set up in such a way that if it's an IP phone or a multifunction printer, they whitelist only the first 3 parts of a MAC address. So the nice thing about it is if I set the first 3 parts of my attacking box to the same thing as a Ricoh or Xerox or Canon or whoever it might be, oftentimes I'll get an IP onto the network and I'll show up as a printer. So in that scenario, when we just demonstrate this during a purple team, we want to make sure that we have understanding and buy-in and feedback from the SME who's in charge of the network access control. We want to make sure that they understand, this is what an attacker's mentality would be, and then give them the tools so that they can identify, okay, what's a way that we can actually identify when an attacker does this? A good example of the way that you could detect this is that in the event that your Xerox, you have a new Xerox on the machine, I don't know who just went forward, but you have a new Xerox on the machine, and it's running a Linux operating system. So looking at the MAC address and then looking at the operating system that's being detected by your network access control is going to be one of those good indicators that, hey, maybe this is not actually a Xerox machine and maybe potentially an indicator of compromise. All right, so going on, if I can. So what should the size consist of? It just depends on whatever type of demographic or industry vertical that you're in. Financial is typically going to be one of the largest. There's going to be manufacturing that's going to be in place. Those that have, this also depends on how many assets and employees that you have. So the teams will range from just ad hoc, meaning, we've got, Ben and Chris over in infrastructure who do this, to you have a full internal red team and a full internal blue with a team of investigators. So it just really ranges, and it depends upon the size of your organization. So for the red teaming, we definitely need people on your red team who understand the current trends and attacks and tactics. This is not going to be somebody that just runs a vulnerability scanner and calls that a red. That's not what we're looking for. Remember, we're looking for those who actively understand the attacker mindset. So you want to make sure that whatever red teamer you have on there, they fully understand how to bypass a lot of these controls and not necessarily rely on a vulnerability to compromise your system. You're definitely going to need buy-in from your system administrators. A lot of these changes that are going to need to be made are going to come from them. There may even be some group policy object changes that you need to push out to your organization to increase the chances of you detecting this malicious behavior. You definitely want your web application security team. There's oftentimes, it's one of the weakest areas for detection controls because they put a lot of controls in place to maybe stop the attack, but not so much to detect when certain requests are being made. A good example of this is if you have a Tomcat box. Oftentimes, developers will spin up a Tomcat box and they'll leave it with the default credentials. Those credentials are typically Tomcat, Tomcat, or admin, admin. Well, an attacker, when they're on a network, they'll just quickly run through and try and find if any of the Tomcat boxes that they've identified still have those default credentials. Again, this is not an exploit. This is just looking for default credentials. If your web application security team is not ingesting those authentication logs into whatever SIM or component that you have, that may be an area that you don't have that insight, and it could allow for an attacker to gain a foothold without having any sort of detection. Because utilizing Tomcat, if they do have the default credentials, they can upload what's called a WAR file. A WAR file is just a compiled Java applet that you can upload to the Tomcat box and interact with the operating system. So we have one that just gives us command line access, and we can run all sorts of commands on the system. Again, this is not an exploit. This is utilizing Tomcat in the way that it was designed to be used. So making sure that we have that team involved so that they have a better understanding. Most importantly is your SIM SMEs. So whatever SIM you're utilizing, whether that's QRadar, Alien Vault, Splunk, an Elk Stack, Graylog, Logarithm, you name it, whatever your SIM is, your SMEs need to be a part of this. They will be the ones ultimately, learning from the red team and turning those into detections. And that's really where that blue team from us or from some other company, typically will sit in with you and help you guys understand this is what we've seen over the industry and this is the best way to detect this attack. Any type of EDR controls, a lot of times your current EDRs now will actually feed those alerts into your SIM. So that allows us to identify the fact that, someone tried to run Mimikatz per se. And let's say one of your EDR controls is protecting that LSASS process, and anything that tries to query that LSASS process, the EDR will catch. Well, making sure that you get those EDR control logs into your SIM so you have that detection is going to be important as well. And as I mentioned before, your network admins, they all need to be a part of this. So the difference here is on a pen test or a red team, you can definitely measure your KPIs because you have, clear, attack, vulnerability, and the result. With this one, it's difficult to apply direct metrics. However, you can map a detection enhancement to what we have. And so what ends up happening is that we give you a baseline of whether or not you have the ability to even get the log. If you have the log, do you even have a detection written? If you have the detection, are you able to detect it no matter whether we hit your servers or your workstations? And so what we can do is, as we identify this at the beginning of the engagement, we can actually show security posture change, because while we're there on site, we'll help you and write the detection for you. And the idea there is to actively show that before you had the logs coming in for all of the authentication successes, but you didn't have a detection to identify when we laterally sprayed. So what we'll do is we'll write the detection, and then we'll rerun the attack, and then all of a sudden an alert will come in saying, you know, Ben just performed a lateral spray. And that's where you can show that your security posture actively begins to change. So obviously we want to make sure that whatever is being done with these detections or whatever, that your security operations center knows and understands what they're looking at. A good example of this is the Kerberos attack. The Kerberos attack allows for any user to query what's called a service principal name account, which is stored on the domain controller. Any user within your organization, as long as they have a user privilege, can do this. It does not require admin privileges. It does not require domain admin privileges. And so the idea is a normal user can query these and get a computed hash of what the password is stored on the domain controller for that specific SPN account. Those hashes can be cracked offline utilizing a password cracker, which potentially could allow an attacker to gain a new set of credentials or even privilege escalation if those SPN accounts have more privilege than their accounts. And so the idea is understanding what that attack looks like, because Kerberos logs are very spammy, and it's very difficult for people to fully understand those. And so communicating what that attack looks like to the Security Operations Center is vital so that they understand this is what this looks like, and this is how you can identify a Kerberos attack from normal Kerberos traffic. So if you want to look at some different scorecards for some KPIs, we have some outside resources out there. There's a great talk from Chris Nickerson and Chris Gates that I encourage you guys to look at. There's also some stuff from MITRE. So if you, I'm sure everyone has, if you've not, but MITRE is it's a framework that basically allows you to understand some of the attacker mentality and attacking tools that are out there, and it kind of categorizes and groups them. And MITRE is a great start, and it's fantastic. But I do want to challenge you and to understand that MITRE is not the end all when it comes to defense. So it's not everything within your organization shouldn't necessarily be, you know, if it's not in MITRE, then we don't have to worry about it, or, you know, where is this in MITRE? MITRE is a great place to start, but it's not all inclusive. And there are several things that we'll do that's not even in MITRE. And so, you know, it's a great place to start. It's a good reference, and they're doing fantastic work. And, you know, we'll definitely reference them in some of the stuff that we do. But there's also some things that just aren't necessarily covered in there because it's more attacker mentality than it is direct exploit. There's also a balanced scorecard that you can use, and I think that, Chris, I think we're going to have this available because I don't think anyone's going to want to have to type that link that goes from there. So.
Yep. Yeah, we'll have it available, Ben. Thanks.
Yep, great. All right. So what does it look like to conduct a purple team? I know we're getting short on time, so I want to make sure that I'm respectful of that. So the first thing that we're going to do when we get into your organization is we're going to establish a baseline. We're going to run every attack, at least you will start off with the top 20 of what we've got. We're going to perform the attacks, and our key here is to identify, do you even have the logs? If you have the logs, do you have actual alerts? Now it's interesting, I want to say an alert is not a technician or a SME running a search within your SIM and saying, I can see you. An alert is an automated response that is done based off of your rule that you have within your SIM, and that is automatically sent and generated as an incident ticket. That is considered an alert. We'll come into some of these engagements, and they'll be like, yeah, we can see that, we got a detection. And I'll say, well, how did you get that detection? And they're like, well, this person ran this query and they're able to see it. Well, that's great for this specific event. The problem is that person isn't always going to be running this query. That person will need to go home at some point. And if that person is no longer employed with you, you lose a lot of that security posture that comes with it. So the idea is when we create any type of detections within this purple team, they're designed to be alerts on their own without human interaction. So some good starting points and some logs that you should definitely be ingesting that most organizations are not are command line auditing, which is event ID 4688, user authentication. We mentioned this earlier. This is going to be 4624. That's for authentication success. 4625 for authentication failure. PowerShell commands 4104. Kerberos query 4769, and new user added 4720. Now we have a full list of them, but just for the demonstration, these are some good starting points for making sure that you have these logs coming into your SIM. Once we've established a baseline, then we'll go through and we'll identify the areas where you are getting logs, but you don't have alerts. So what we'll do is we'll look for abnormal behaviors. A good example of that is if someone's trying to obfuscate a command, whether that's within the command prompt or PowerShell. One of the things that we've identified through these engagements is a lot of those obfuscation techniques, they will have a significant number of commas within the command line process. So I'm going to go back a slide. So if you look at that command line auditing 4688, this is where we're going to see those commas. And this is why it's so important for you guys to ingest 4688 within your SIM. So what we'll do is we'll actually count the number of commas that are in there, and we set a certain threshold. And the amazing thing is that just counting the commas, we're able to detect multiple different attacks just because of that comma thing. And so the great thing is that when you begin to look at your detections from that point of view, instead of you just looking at one attack, you actually get to cover multiple now. So when we first came up with this comma detection, I needed a name for it. And so for the client, I decided to call it comma, 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 chameleon. So, you know, and that worked out really well, and it was really neat. It just made it awkward when another pen testing company came in and they ran an obfuscation attack, and the client called Dave and they're like, hey, you know, your comma chameleon caught someone, and Dave had no idea what they were talking about. So, but it made it a lot of fun, and it caught a detection. We'll build the detection for the attack, even if there's a control that blocks it. The reason that we'll do that, if you have an EDR and it's like, hey, the EDR stopped Mimikatz. Well, that's great, but we still want to detect it. The control could be removed. The attacker, when they got on the box, they could disable whatever EDR that you might have. If there's a way to bypass that control, you always want layered controls. And so if you have a deflection control, which an EDR would do, you still want to have a detection control on there, if for no other reason than as a safety net in the event that your EDR fails or is bypassed. Then we'll do the same attack multiple different ways to ensure that the detection catches all attacks. A good example of this is if we do a brute force of your users trying to find a weak password. There's several different ways that you can do this. You can do this with a Metasploit module. You can do this with a tool called crackmathexec, or you can even write a program in PowerShell to do this. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that whatever detection that we have is able to identify the attack regardless of the tool that's used by the user. And so what we'll do is we'll run the attack multiple different ways to make sure that you understand this is what this looks like. After we've built the detections, then we're going to rerun those attacks and we're going to refine them. The idea here is we don't want to have a bunch of detections that just generate an immense amount of noise for your organization. We understand that your security teams are under-resourced. So just adding 1,000 alerts to your SIM is not going to provide any sort of value to you. So what we do is we end up working on making sure that these detections are high fidelity, meaning there's very few, if no, false positives. We want to make sure that the noise to signal ratio is extremely low, and so that way the fidelity on the detection is high. Now, it could take some tuning. We remove some known systems that maybe emulate an attack. A good example of this is your vulnerability scanner. Oftentimes when we write these detections, your vulnerability scanner comes up, which it should because it's performing malicious behavior within your organization. If a detection is not possible, then what we do is we'll look at are there ways that we can increase your controls on deflecting, maybe stopping the attack? Or is there a deterrence that we can put into place that could prevent the attack from, while the attack may be successful, the attacker can't utilize any of the information? A good example of a deterrence that you can improve within your organization is to make sure that all of your SPN accounts that you have on the domain controller have a password that is set to a minimum of 25 characters. So the reason that's a good deterrence is you can't necessarily stop a user from pulling your SPN accounts using the Kerberos attack. You can detect it for sure, but let's say that for whatever reason you don't have the ability to detect Kerberosing. Adding a deterrence in there of making sure that all of your passwords are 25 characters, what that does is it prevents me from necessarily cracking those offline. So yeah, you got all of our SPNs, but you can't crack them, so good luck. And so that would be what we would consider a deterrent. Once we have all of these things done, then what we're going to do is we're going to replay those attacks. We want to make sure that as we've gotten everything done, that your blue team can now say, okay, we're going to run a lateral spray. And we run the lateral spray, your blue team's like, yep, we got it, we got the right alert, it's only coming in once, we got the lateral spray, great. We're going to run a weak credential harvest. Okay, yep, we see you coming in, we got the alert, great. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we didn't over-engineer the detection so that we were so specific on one thing, and we run the attack a little bit differently to make sure that when your blue team sees it, even if it's a slightly different variation of the attack, it still comes up under the same detection. We'll then validate that the fidelity and alert to make sure we didn't miss any of the other systems, and then we'll call that as a actual detection. Once we're done writing the detections, we're going to look at some of the deflection controls. And again, a deflection is anything that's actually going to stop the attack. A good example of a deflection would be your antivirus or your EDR solution. Now, most of these are going to be signature-based or behavior-based in accessing certain controls within memory, but oftentimes they don't always integrate with your SIM. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that, one, that you have some controls that you can put in place on there, and two, that they're actually, any alerts that are happening are coming into a SIM, or two, that the product alerting system that is currently in place is being utilized. We'll also look at some other detections that may not necessarily be covered under deflection and work to increase either detection or deterrence if you don't really have an area of that deflection control. Then we'll evaluate deterrence. We're going to evaluate, are you actually patching well? While you do want to have detections on lateral sprays and weak credential harvest, what you don't want to do is afford an attacker an easy way to gain a foothold within your organization. Having MS17010 or MS08067 on your network is not necessarily a great idea. So we want to evaluate that. We want to make sure that you are patching things the way that they should. We're also going to determine if the current GPO policies are sufficient to render a successful attack moot. A good example of that is if your current GPO policy allows for passwords that are extremely weak and easily guessable, we're definitely going to look at that and say, while you want to detect if someone's going to try and brute force a password, having your users use passwords like summer 2019 or August 2019 is not a great idea because most people know about them and most people are going to test for them. And so we'll look at that. We'll also look at, are there ways we can deploy and test honeypots, honeycreds, and honey tokens? Now, honeypot, most people have heard of. A honeypot is just a system that will respond to certain network requests. It may have some fake services spun up on it, such as a web service, a FTP, or SSH. Honeycreds are a little bit different. A honeycred is a credential that is broadcast on the network. It's a tool that I wrote called honeycreds. And honeycreds will put a set of fake credentials onto the wire and broadcast those out. Now, these credentials don't have to exist within your domain controller, but they can be captured by a tool called Responder. Responder is one of the great ways that we can capture hashes of user credentials off the wire. It doesn't require any access to any of your system resources. It just requires that we're on the same network and the same broadcast domain as another system. Well, honeycreds sets a fake set of credentials out on the wire. And the idea about honeycreds is that once the attacker has these fake sets of credentials, they're going to attempt to use them. So instead of you trying to hunt down for malicious behavior all across your users, you can focus your attention on this one fake account and know that if you ever see any authentication requests from this fake account, you'll know that you have an indicator of compromise, because that account should never have been known by anybody within your organization. The third one is honey tokens. Honey tokens are actually fake credentials that are injected into memory. So Mimikatz will oftentimes dump the credentials from memory out of LSASS. Well, honey tokens puts a fake set of credentials into memory. Again, utilizing the same methodology as the honeycreds, instead of you looking for misuse of multiple users, you can focus your attention onto the fake credentials. If you see any authentication requests come in from those honey tokens, that allows you to have a greater detection into that indicator of compromise, because no one should know that those fake credentials exist because they only exist in memory. One of the things that we'll also recommend is looking at paths of least resistance. An attacker that's on your network, whether that's an internal threat or an external, they understand that they don't necessarily have an infinite amount of time to do whatever activity that they want to do, whether that's data exfiltration or to deploy ransomware. And so oftentimes they will move in somewhat of a fast motion. What we want to do is we want to offer paths for the attacker to take that puts them in a place where they're going to have a greater chance of detection. An example of this is to have a honeypot system, clear credentials, or even a fake SPN account that we put into our domain controller. Utilizing these paths of least resistance, let's say I put a set of plain text credentials into an open share, and I wait for the user to pick them up. Well, an attacker who sees an open share and they see those credentials, the first thing they're going to do is going to try them. And so the idea is to create these little baits, and you want to move the attacker into the direction that you want to go. And the idea then is, instead of you having to search through 40,000 assets, you're really only looking at about 100. And so you want to implement paths of least resistance to get them to go where you want them to go and increase your detection around those areas. So honeypots are going to be a great way of doing it, having a set of fake credentials, putting, if you have open NFS shares on your systems, is to drop a set of fake credentials into one of those NFS shares. Another good least resistance is if you have done a penetration test or an external red or an external pen test, and you've done any sort of open source intelligence as part of that engagement, you might have identified that one of the penetration testers or the consultants have identified a set of credentials on a public resource, such as Pastebin, GitHub, or some other site. If that user doesn't exist, or that user is no longer part of the organization, or even if they are, instead of you trying to hide it and take it down and get rid of it, you can use that as a honey credential. So let's say I'm on an engagement and I see, Chris's information is out on, some dump on Pastebin. Well, instead of me trying to get that off of Pastebin or remove it or whatever, I just turn his account into a honey account, because I know that other attackers are going to utilize this. So I change Chris's account because it's out there. I change it, do some education, making sure that he doesn't put that back out there. But instead of me trying to take it down, I now just increase my detection on that account that's out there, because I know if anyone's going to do open source intelligence, they're going to come across it. And that's going to afford me a greater chance of identifying any type of malicious actor utilizing that resource. Once we look at deterrence, we look at any other techniques that are not covered under deterrence. And if we identify the areas, the whole idea is with detection, deflection, and deterrence, you want to be strong in at least one. And ideally, you want to be strong in two. It is very difficult to be strong in all three, but not impossible. So the idea is, if you can't stop the attack, then detect it or deter it. If you can't stop the attack or deter it, then you want to detect it. The idea is you want to focus, the purple team engagement will focus on improving the security posture in one of those areas for each of the techniques that we go through. So this was another example of path of least resistance. We can create service principal accounts. We can put fake credentials into memory. We can deploy honeypots. We'll transmit fake NTLM credentials over the wire. And we can utilize some of the attacker techniques defensively. Now, this is something that I'm recently working on and haven't fully published all of the details for, but I wanted to demonstrate one of the ways that we can use an attacker technique defensively. Now, this is an idea of just showing you one potential way of doing this. This is not me saying go and do this on your environments right now, but it's more of a demonstration of how you can, once you learn some of these attacker techniques, you can actually utilize some of them as a defense. An example of this is the sticky keys attack. The sticky keys attack, what that does is if you press Shift 5 times on a Windows box, it'll bring up a accessibility program that calls for sticky keys. Now, the point of the sticky keys is if you have a inability to press 2 keys at the same time, whether that's you only have a single arm or your hands don't work the same way, it's an accessibility technique that if you wanted to press Shift R, you could press Shift and let go, and then press R, and it would be an upper R. So it's a helpful technique. The difficult thing is that we can use a registry key, and we can remap sticky keys to the command prompt, and we can use this as a privilege escalation technique. Well, instead of utilizing it for a privilege escalation technique, I utilize this to keep my young boys' computers safe. My boys have recently, been given laptops. They're doing some development programming, and there was nothing that they needed with PowerShell. And so I did this. So as you can see in this example, in the first command, I ran just the PowerShell command of get date from the command prompt. You'll see that it returned the date. Well, I used an attacker technique of utilizing those image file execution options. And what I did was, in PowerShell, I just pointed it to a debugger program called Nope. Well, it just so happens Nope doesn't exist. So now when PowerShell attempts to run, it'll return an error message saying it can't find it. So these are some of the ideas. When you begin to learn and understand how the attacking world comes, you have a better idea of different ways that you can improve your defense across your organization. At the end of the day, that is the goal of the purple team. It is not an us versus them. It's not a red versus blue. It's all of us working together to improve security posture.
Okay, Ben, thank you very much. It was a great presentation. I know we're a little bit past the hour, but if you got some time, we'll answer some of the questions that, we've gotten some great questions. So if people do have to jump off, we are recording this. We will record this question and answer. So you will get the presentation and the recording emailed to you tomorrow. But we'll kick it off with Ben. First question here: with all the attack techniques out there, which ones do you tend to purple team first?
So with all the attacks that are out there, we will tend to look at the weak credential harvest. That's going to be the ones where we're looking for the summer 2019 as the password. We're going to be looking at the lateral spray. If someone's got a set of valid credentials, looking to see if that's across the network. We're going to look at curb roasting. That's one of the easiest ones that oftentimes has the greatest risk because you can get to DA very fast in that way. We'll also look at, default credential harvesting, looking for ways to quickly gain access to a system like JBoss or Tomcat. We'll also look at, looking at catching responder. So those are going to be the first ones that we're definitely going to look at initially, from there. But those are the ones that we start almost every purple team engagement. If we haven't done one, that's really where we want to start.
Okay, great. Second question: during purple team engagements, how do you avoid the Hawthorne effect? Subjects preparing or performing better with knowledge of the test happening. Would it make sense to red team first, then purple team to address the results of the red team assessment?
So that's a great question. Well, we're looking at two different things. We're looking at having a red team with a single potential attack path and then evaluating our blue. Well, that's still necessary, and that should be done after a purple team. The purple team is designed to teach and educate and make sure that the blue understands what the red is doing. If the red comes in and, breaks everything, and they're like, well, you need to fix this. Well, it doesn't, not all of it can be fixed. A good example is if they curb roast and they're successful, they may not necessarily be able to fix that. So having that education and that sharing point allows them to understand that technique. So then the point would then be to have as a single engagement for the purple team, then to conduct a red and then look at it from the blue's perspective is, can you actually detect this new attack? If the new red team comes in and they have new attacks, new techniques or whatever, that could be something that you evaluate in your next purple team and say, hey, well, the red team came in and they performed this never before seen attack, and we didn't have the right logs set up to detect this. And that's where that new purple team could come into play. And so the idea is not to keep it an us versus them. It's your pen tests and your red teams are meant to grow and strengthen and improve your security posture. And the only way we're going to get that is when we're actually all working on the same team, and we all need to learn from each other. And it's okay that the red knows the blue, and it's okay that the blue knows the red.
Okay, thanks. Next question. If we don't currently have capacity with our SIM to collect logs from all workstations and we want to monitor the baseline events, are those all available from domain controllers?
So they're not. So not every log that you need comes from the domain controller. A good example of this is if I do a lateral spray. If I authenticate to a workstation, the authentication log lives on the endpoint, even if I authenticate with a domain account. So if I authenticate with Chris's account, but I point it to a laptop and not a domain controller, the success or failure will only be on his laptop, not on the domain controller. And this is also another reason, if I go in and I'm doing a weak credential harvest, where I dump all of your users and I run every user with one-time password of summer 2019, I'm not going to trip any lockouts. I'm just going to do it once, and I'm going to wait. I'm only going to target an endpoint for a workstation because oftentimes the monitoring is only on the server side. Even though those accounts are all domain level, the logs only exist on the workstation. And this is one of the areas where we find that organizations have the least insight due to those ingestion levels. One of the tricks that you can use if you're having an issue with logging and licensing is look at the Windows logging cheat sheets. The Windows logging cheat sheets will give you an idea of the minimum logs that you need to ingest. One of the logs that we'll see oftentimes eating up a significant amount of a SIM are Windows firewall event logs. And I think those are 5162, 5164. The problem is that while there's a lot of those logs, it oftentimes can eat up 30 to 40, and I've seen it as high as 50% of your total ingestion of your logs, while zero detections have been designed around them within your organization. That's not to say that you can't build detections around Windows event logs, but if you're struggling for, do I pull in event, success and failure, or Windows firewall logs, I'm going to recommend that you pull in Windows success and failure.
Okay, thanks. What do you use to run these baseline sets of attacks? Just a script, an adversary SIM framework, something else, proprietary?
So we don't have some sort of framework. There are some tools that are being utilized right now. I think one is called Mordor, which has this that's out there. MITRE also has a tool called Sigma, which will help you build some of the detections based off of some of their alerts that they've built in there. But most of the time, we're just running the attacks utilizing the tools that we use every day. These are going to be tools that are such as, Metasploit, crackmap exec. I even have just normal PowerShell scripts. And the great thing about that is what we don't want to do is when we build a detection is to have it to be so specific to a specific tool set that if someone does a technique slightly different, we miss it in our detection control. And so having multiple tools run the same attack is vital to make sure that your detection is high fidelity. One of the examples of that is if I run a authentication request with Metasploit, it's going to look slightly different than if I run it with correct.exec. The host name is going to be a little bit different, and the way that the authentication comes in will be slightly different. And so what we want to do is make sure that our detections are tool agnostic.
Okay, thanks, Ben. For honey tokens, do you have to use an Active Directory account?
No. So honey tokens and honey creds are designed to use fake credentials. But the credentials should look somewhat legitimate. They should look as though they're potentially going to be a legitimate credential within your organization. A good example of this is to utilize a service account. So something like SCCM Updater, or something that looks like a process that happens on a consistent basis. A good example of this is SQL Service or something. And so the idea is you want to make sure that it looks legitimate enough to entice the attacker to utilize it without it necessarily being a valid account. What we don't want to do is utilize a valid account and have them have a foothold within the domain controller. So these accounts, honey tokens and honey creds, do not exist within the domain controller.
Okay, great. We'll do a couple more. I appreciate everybody hanging on the line here. How do we convince management that we need a purple team if they're hesitant about a red team?
So the nice thing about the difference between a red team and a purple team is oftentimes the red team, you might only define a single or second security posture change that you can make. You might only find a single weakness, a single attack path. With the purple team, one of the ways that we get management to buy in is to show them that when we conduct a purple team, that even before we get on the plane at the end of the week, your security posture will actively change because we've written the detections while we're there with you on site. The nice thing about this too is that when you get the report, it isn't a report of all the things that you need to fix that could take 6 months to a year. It's a report of this is how you actively change your security posture, and you can now detect these attacks. Now, there may be some things that need to change within your organization and may require slight work, but 90% of the report is we wrote this detection for you, and you now have insight where you didn't before. So before we even get on the plane, before we leave your office, your security posture actively changes. And we get to show that in like a heat graph and a matrix for them. Every organization that I've ever done a purple team for, they have always said that they have received more value out of doing this purple team than any other pen test or red team combined.
All right, thanks, Ben. Last question. How would you recommend tracking which capabilities are available to an internal red or blue team as those teams evolve? Would the MITRE ATT&CK Navigator be suitable?
So definitely, MITRE ATT&CK is a great place to start. It is not the all-encompassing. There are some things that are being done that aren't being captured in MITRE. One of the things I encourage you is to make sure that your blue team is following and maintaining and learning from the red team. And this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to send them all to a conference, as most conferences record the talks. I would encourage lunch and learns. I would encourage trainings and events, things that you guys can go and you can learn these different techniques and then bring those back and say, okay, there's now this new tool out there. So Silent Trinity is a good example. It was just released at Black Hat Arsenal, and that's in its beta version. But if you haven't heard of Silent Trinity, you need to go and look and see what that looks like. It's an entire command and control infrastructure. And so the idea would be to find the video or presentation on it and sit down and lunch and learn and look at and see what that looks like so that you guys have a better understanding of what those are. You definitely want to utilize a tool like MITRE just to give you a place to start, but it should not be something that's utilized as a crutch, whereas, well, we did everything in MITRE, so we're good. Not everything is going to be captured in MITRE.
Okay, thanks again, Ben. We'll end it there. Ben, thank you very much for your time. Everybody, we really appreciate you joining. As I said, we will send the webinar replay tomorrow along with the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at webinar@trustedsec.com. But again, thanks everybody for joining. Ben, thank you for your time, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Bye-bye.